Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody can see me. Yes, so welcome to our discussion under the Golden Dome, which is a virtual panel discussion hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and the School of Arts and Letters, as well as the Middle Georgia State University Political Science Student Organization and the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. So before we get started, I want to briefly introduce you to the political science program at Middle Georgia State, as well as introduce our panelists and go into our structure of our event and things like that. For those of you that have not joined us for events before, we have a number of programs in political science here at Middle Georgia State, including the Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science, as well as minors in political science, African and African diaspora studies, environmental policy studies, local government administration, global studies, and pre-law, as well as the certificate in European Union studies. So if you're interested in any of those things, feel free to let us know and talk to your advisor about potentially considering a major or minor or a certificate in one of those areas. Okay, so let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. Um, First, we have Dr. Matthew Caverly, who's an assistant professor of public safety, who's been here at Middle Georgia State, both as a lecturer and now as assistant professor since 2016. His doctorate in political science is from the University of Florida. We also have Dr. John Hall, who is an associate professor of political science and has been here at Middle Georgia State since 2015. His doctorate in public policy administration is from the Auburn University. And then I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm a professor of political science and have been here at Middle Georgia State since 2012. And my doctorate in political science is from the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. So for those of you that have not been to our events before, we'll briefly introduce the structure of the event here and some of the ground rules. First, we have a few topics that our panelists and I have discussed over the past few days, and so we'll get started with some questions based on those topics, which I'm now bringing up in a window, so I'm kind of multitasking here. Apologies for that. And then also, we will be accepting your questions as well. We're excited to have your questions as well as we go through the panel today. So you are welcome to ask those questions in the chat window. The only real ground rules are first, if you do have multiple questions, we're happy to take multiple questions from individuals, but we do want to prioritize giving everybody an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have more than one question, we may not ask your second question right away or something like that. We may let somebody else have their question first. We'll try to get all the questions that we get in the chat. We'll try to get to all of those today. We are on a fairly strict deadline to get done because one of our panelists has to be somewhere else at 5 o'clock or has to leave at 5 o'clock strict. So sometimes we go over, but I don't think we're going to be able to do that today. And then also our audience members are asked to be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. So please uphold the standards of civility and respect that we expect of all of the members of the Middle Georgia State University community. So some of our topics today may include the state budget and taxes, always big important things for any legislature to do, as well as things coming out of the state legislature that may be affecting public and higher education, a religious liberty bill or state religious freedom restoration act. We may talk about that. A couple of laws that may have affected people that are transgender. State school zone speed cameras. Say that 6 times fast. Tort reform. What is tort reform? That sort of thing. Election security issues and betting on sports. All sorts of exciting topics that our state legislature at least thought about dealing with this term. So without too much further ado, because we are on a little bit of a time crunch, I don't know why it keeps notifying me of things I already knew. We will try to go ahead and get started with our first question, and that is, A little bit of a just kind of background question. So last Friday, the um, Friday of last week, I think that was the 4th, was what is known as Sine Die. So what is Sine Die? It's a Latin term, apparently. So what does that mean? And how does it relate to the Georgia General Assembly's calendar? And it looks like Dr. Hall is unmuted, so I'll let him go ahead and tackle that question first, and then Dr. Caverly can follow up if he feels that Dr. Hall's answer is incomplete.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, and thank you, everyone. Thank other faculty and staff and students for being here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Caverly, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for being the moderator. Sine Die, what is that? Again, it is Latin. It's specifically for without day, or better yet, without a day, meaning if you are going to adjourn without a day that you plan on returning, you are finished. That is the fancy way of saying the Georgia legislature has completed its legislative session for the year. I believe constitutionally, or under the Georgia Constitution, they are only allowed 40 days in session. They start in early January, they finish off well around now in April. And the very last day of the legislative cycle for this year was on Friday. They usually go all the way to midnight or even past midnight, but they were able to finish up in the evening. So any bills that have not passed through the House and the Senate by last Friday are dead. They are not coming back. They would have to be reintroduced at next year's legislative session. Now, it's interesting to note that while the legislative session is over on Friday, the governor and his power to veto or sign legislation, that stretches out until about May 14th, if memory serves. So the governor still has the ability to, of course, sign bills into law, but some of the legislation that is passed to the House and the Senate could still be vetoed by Governor Kemp. So that's where we are now. The Georgia legislative session ended on Friday, and Governor Kemp has until about mid-May to sign or veto legislation. And of course, just to give everyone an understanding of the Georgia legislature, it has a House and a Senate, just like for our American government students, just like the federal legislature has a House and a Senate. And the Georgia legislature, the House and the Senate, are controlled by the Republican Party. The Senate is 33 to 23. The House is about 100 to 80 Republican Democrat. So again, the legislative session has ended, and we are moving on with Governor Kemp's decisions, many of which he has already made.
I don't really think there's anything much to add on that. I think that was fully comprehensive. I'll only provide a context that it's actually the legislative norm across legislatures all around the world to have a certain calendar, a certain timeline where they start things and they have to be done by. And if anything you don't get done during that time, dies. And in fact, that's a way of killing legislation is to run out the clock. And so it seems that was done with at least some of these proceedings. And that is a common legislative strategy. It's done by both Republicans and Democrats. It's done in every legislature. It's actually, if this was a comparative thing, we could talk about that parliaments around the world do this sort of thing. So that's not that unusual in that. So anyway, I'll just add that little bit in there. But Sine Die is there's really in the Georgia legislative calendar. I'll just add this: the Georgia legislative calendar has basically two big dates. Well, they have their initial date where they start things, where the legislative session begins, and then along the way they have what they call crossover day, which means that the bill has to clear one of the chambers to go over to the other chamber, and if it hasn't cleared that chamber, it dies. And then there's Sine Die, and that's the day that we just passed, which is officially the end of the legislative assembly, the legislative session, and we have to wait for the next session. Although I will say this: just because a bill dies in this session does not mean that the bill is dead. It is dead for that legislative session, but it can be reintroduced in the very next legislative session. So. Hope springs eternal for many a dead bill. They tend to live again. And if it is popular enough with the party in power, it will live again. And if there's been studies that have indicated that if you run it up enough times, as long as your party stays in power, it will eventually get through. So I think that that's more than enough said about that.
Okay, thank you all. So first substantive question, I guess. One of the critical tasks of the General Assembly each year is to establish a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And that new fiscal year will start in July in Georgia. So Georgia's fiscal year is July 1st through June 30th, which is different from the federal fiscal year, which starts in October and ends in September. So what are some of the highlights of the upcoming 2026 fiscal year budget for next year, starting in July, and any changes in the budget that's finishing out this fiscal year over the next, I guess, 3 months or so?
Well, I guess since Professor Hall took the lead on the last one, I'll try to take the lead on this one. I don't know. Well, first of all, I'll start out with budgeting. Budgeting is a primary job of legislatures everywhere. There are, if you study legislatures, what you'll find is that legislatures have to meet the bar in two things. There's two things that fundamentally give them power. One is the power of initiation. That means that they can make policy. But the other is the power of the purse, money. Because if you can initiate things, but you don't have any money to do anything with, you're not going to get very far. And so the power of budgeting is set by the Georgia Constitution, and for that matter, basically all the state constitutions, firmly in the legislature. It's a part of philosophical legislative supremacy. It's long been an area of budgetary control that dates back to fights from colonial times regarding who should have the power over the purse. So the legacy of budgetary power lying with the state legislature is a long held thing, comes out of Revolutionary era and so on and so forth. But I will say this about a very interesting difference between the state budgets, and including Georgia's, and the federal budget. The states are contained in a way that the federal government is not. The states, in most states, including Georgia's, and it says it right in the Georgia Constitution, for the most part, have to operate within the black. In other words, they have to pay for what they do, and they can't run a line of credit. Now they can in an emergency situation they can for a short period of time. We did during the pandemic and so forth. There are certain things you can run a certain amount of debt, but the point is you can't run debt like they can in the national government. National government operates, its budgetary politics operate a lot like a large corporation. They run off a line of credit. And in fact, for the history majors out there, one of the big things about the founding of America was to assume the continental armies, the debt, the continental government's debt, and the debt of the states upon the federal government. That created the line of credit. Well, the states don't have that. They don't have that luxury. They got to pay for what they do. And so before I go any further in that, I just want to say that in state budgetary politics operate fundamentally in a different manner, I would argue, than what occurs at the federal level because of that. Now, having said that, then there are winners and losers in every budgetary session, and I found a wonderful list of who won and who lost in this kind of thing. But I'll also say this about writ large things about budgetary politics. The budgetary politics tend to reflect the dominant political groups in any state. And that is, if you look at, there's an old saying about budgets that you know what's valued by what they put value into. you'll see a tendency for how the dominant political parties, the dominant interest groups and social movements and other areas within a state are reflected in the politics of that state. So budgetary politics. So for instance, if you look into Georgia's budget overwhelming over time, what you're going to find a lot of stuff for agriculture. And that's because we're an agrarian state. We have a legacy of that goes back to colonial times, and so on and so forth. If you look more recently, you'll also find a lot of budgetary monies that go into economic development because the state of Georgia has been on an attempt to diversify its economy, to somewhat build an industrial base, to build a trading base, to build an entertainment industry around Atlanta. And you see those things reflected in budgetary measures. I guess the final thing that I'll say about a writ large, a bit about budgets, is that the budgetary politics are something that states have to do every year, just like the federal government does. But I just want to say there is a difference. In the federal government, we know that because they can run off a line of credit, and increasingly because of the rise of divided government, there's been a tendency to have governance, budgetary governance in recent years. In fact, we're on it right now by continuous resolution. We talked a little bit about that in the last presentation we did. The states don't really have that kind of a luxury. Now, they can go a little bit if they don't get their act together, but for the most part, states produce budgets. And those budgets tend to reflect who has power. And in states where the power is a bit divided, the budgets look like that. In states where power is concentrated at the state level, like our state, our budgets tend to reflect writ large more conservative values than they do liberal values. Now, if we were in New York State, we'd have the opposite. But so that's one thing I'll just say about that. So people that do political culture, talk about regional political cultures, that's a manifestation of what they call traditionalism. But you'll see those kinds of things there. And as we dig down into this, because we're going to talk about these initiatives, they're all contained within the budget in one fashion or form. The immigration and the income tax reduction and all that sort of thing. But if you look at what got in there, overwhelmingly, it tends to reflect the priorities of conservatism, and that means very often at the expense of liberalism. And now I'm going to shut up and turn things over to Professor Hall, who knows more about this stuff than I do.
Oh, I disagree. Thank you, Dr. Caverly. That was a fantastic summary of state and federal budgetary powers and responsibilities. There are several specifics in the budget that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the evening. So I'll focus on just some generals. The budget overall was about $38 billion. Now, comparing that to the United States federal government, the budget, I think the last is in excess of $5.5 to almost $6 trillion. It is a little bit less than the amended 2025 budget. We've added about $4 billion to the 2025 budget, bringing it to a little over $40 billion. And a lot of that involves like almost $4.5 billion of increased spending for hurricane relief. We have over $600 million for hurricane relief because of the devastating hurricane that came through, about $1 billion in infrastructure development. While we will address other elements of the budget later, one thing that I did see that is interesting that the Kemp administration has pushed through is a significant increase in funding for Georgia state prisons. We're looking at over $200 million in increased prison financial support. And a lot of that has to do with federal judicial branch inquiries into the state of Georgia's prisons, that they have been overcrowded, that the infrastructure is falling apart. So some of this has been aggressively encouraged by the federal government. We're looking at like a 4% pay raise across the board for all corrections officers. They're actually trying to hire, I think it's around 700 additional corrections officers. So anyone who's looking into a career in that, this is an exciting time. And there are, of course, tens of millions of dollars set aside for improving the infrastructure of the state's prisons. So overall, a $38 billion budget, while maintaining a robust rainy day account of about $16 billion. Georgia has an extraordinary rainy day account that many states would envy, and that itself is a source of debate, whether we should maintain a rainy day fund or use that money for current projects. So we'll talk more about the budget as we go through, but great job, Dr. Caverly. I really don't have much to add.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. So moving along to another topic, I guess we'll have Dr. Hall go ahead and tackle this one first. Has the legislature done anything significant affecting K through 12 or higher education during this session?
Yes, great question. The Georgia State Legislature has aggressively pushed forward with one particular program that is overwhelmingly controversial at the state and the federal level, mainly at the state level, because states are the ones who were predominantly in charge of public education, K through 12 and post-secondary. The state has passed $141 million for private school voucher program. Now, for anyone wondering, what is the school voucher program? The school voucher program at the state level, and several states take part, several don't. It involves an attempt by government to alleviate the academic suffering of public school students who are in public school districts that are failing. This basically allows for parents to send their children to private academic institutions in the area instead of sending them to public school. The school voucher program involves giving parents access to these school vouchers that would allow them to send their kids to private schools. So anyone hearing this for the very first time, you might wonder, what's the controversy? If my children are in a public school that is failing, consistently failing year after year after year, what's wrong with the state giving school vouchers that would allow me to send my kids to a private school that is academically quite successful and regularly sends its graduates off to successful post-secondary careers? The controversy comes in a couple of areas. First and foremost, any money spent on school vouchers is money not spent on public schools. So if you have failing public schools and you have a robust school voucher program where people are sending their kids to private schools, in some ways it does resemble an abandonment of the schools that are failing who need the most help. In addition, there are some constitutional issues if that money is used to send you to a private school that is more of a parochial school, or let's say a Catholic school. And if public dollars are being spent sending kids to private schools that have a religious mission, that in and of itself could be controversial. The Supreme Court has long since upheld the constitutionality of school voucher programs. So that's where we are now. Georgia is definitely leaping ahead in its attempt to improve access for public school students in failing school districts and allowing them to go to private schools. But the controversy remains. Again, every penny not spent on public education is money not spent on public education. And two, there are religious institutions that can cloud the constitutional nature of the voucher program. In addition to that, and this is exciting to all of us, there has been just over $75 million earmarked for improved capital projects throughout the USG, the University System of Georgia. So maybe we'll see some of that money filtering into Middle Georgia State. In addition to that, again, school voucher programs, that is, in my opinion, the biggest ticket item involving K through 12 and higher education. There's also been a ban on K through 8. The attempt was K through 12, but they settled on kindergarten through 8th grade. We're putting a ban on accessing personal devices during the school day. So anyone between kindergarten and 8th grade will be, by state law, prohibited from accessing their cell phones during school days. This is relatively popular with the average Georgia voter. Over 50% of Georgia teachers, when they were polled, said that access to cell phones, access to social media during the school day is getting in the way of public education. The negative side could be a reduced ability of parents to get in contact with their kids if they're in K through 8. And the legislation didn't provide what opponents would consider a robust exemption for that. But there are exemptions for students. So K through 8, we are banning all cell phones in public schools across the state of Georgia. There's also one other element. This actually deals with a public shooting that happened. I'm sure many of us remember about 7-8 months ago at Appalachia High School. There was a mass shooting that where 2 students and 2 faculty members were murdered at a public high school in Georgia. The state has passed, and this is relatively controversial. It's an extraordinarily beneficial program. What it's trying to do is nothing but a good thing, but it does so in a controversial way. The House bill says that public schools are now required to create plans addressing the behavioral health needs of students. And here's the thing: identify, assess, and mitigate potential threats made by students. So if a student is talking or writing or expressing something that teachers consider to be potentially threatening, there is now a system in place where they can report that to the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. Now, the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency would be responsible for discerning what constitutes a credible threat. So on the one hand, if you have troubled students who are making troubling threats, or if they are speaking in a way or writing in a way that constitutes a possible threat, we now have a streamlined infrastructure for the teachers to report that to the state of Georgia, and for the state of Georgia to then assess the problem and see what should be done next. The concern is that you can have children or public school kids, students, that are speaking in a way that might be interpreted by a teacher as threatening, but it's not threatening at all. There are certain ways that high school kids, that middle school kids, junior high school kids will talk when they're speaking with their friends. They might be exaggerating something. They might be ironic with something that they say, and they could wind up on a temporary watch list by the state of Georgia. So on the one hand, this new program will help provide a system that will allow teachers and the state of Georgia to identify possible dangerous threats in the future. On the other hand, it could misinterpret kids as they are communicating with one another and put them on a watch list by the state of Georgia that they don't need to be on. So this is something that we will watch over the next few years to see how it develops. Totally lost track of how long I was talking there, so I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Dr. Cavalier.
Well, thank you. I think that was overall a great coverage on all of those little subtopics within there. The only thing I'll say, so it's a vouchers in particular are a fascinating subject from a intellectual standpoint this way. Vouchers, magnet schools, charter schools, all this kind of stuff. If you look back into the history of that issue, those issues and the related policy, they actually started on the left. That's where they originated from. They originated with liberal activists and stuff coming out of the 60s and the 70s. But they're an example of what has been referred to as policy or issue co-optation, where something originates in one side, but the other side takes it over. And so conservative groups in the Republican Party more generally have successfully co-opted vouchers and charter schools and that sort of thing. And so it's an interesting. And so again, remember what I said, it reflects what you will see in these is the reflection at the state level of the dominance of conservative outlooks in Georgia politics. This is another example. These are specific examples of that. You see this educationally. I see some questions. There was interesting comments in the chat about the monies. That's basically the argument against vouchers, is that vouchers have become the employment of privileged groups rather than underprivileged groups, so that they can avoid monies going into public schools, and so that's what really runs it in there. So it does raise a question about education, because which, by the way, this thing with education, education has historically been one of the great purviews of state power. It's also simultaneously been one of the great purviews local governments, which has often created some kind of conflicts between the states and the localities. And in particular, with things like vouchers and related things, that even the issue regarding law enforcement, the sharing of information, you can create battles within, if you will, between local school boards and even local schools within local school boards and state overwatching authorities and that sort of thing. But again, once again, I would say with the issue of the sharing of information, that would fit within law and order type things that you will find very popular in this state. I think about cell phones as an interesting phenomenon. I mean, even at the college level, there's often you hear professors griping a little bit about the students pulling out their phones all the time. But that's I will say this, that I don't know. We might be a little too late. Culturally, the generations now they operate through these things. So I don't know how effective this is. This would be interesting to watch to see if they're actually effective in turning back the clock on something like this. I don't know. For economic development growth in order for nonprofits to say. There's interesting question from Sabrina asked about here about economic development growth. As far as I understand it, regarding for nonprofits in the state of Georgia, there are monies that are out there. But again, I would tell you this, that the level of money is not present here in southern states, especially deep southern states, as you would find in other places of the country. If you went to my home state of Wisconsin, you would find a relatively robust amount of economic development money that would specifically go to nonprofit groups. But here, you're not going to find that as much, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The stuff is out there. If you do your research into grants, you could probably, if you work for one, you could probably find money. Also, keep in mind that you can get money from philanthropic sources as well. You don't necessarily have to just go straight. There's a lot of economic development money from larger nonprofits that go to smaller nonprofits. So that's just something to think about in the politics of nonprofits. So hopefully that was some help to you, Sabrina. Okay. Well, I will shush up now.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, one thing I would add on the nonprofit front, if you look at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, they're probably going to be the main conduit for any state funds, or for that matter, federal funds that are administered as block grants and things like that probably are coming through, DCA and perhaps some other agencies as well. So yeah, I would look at that. Grants.gov is the federal kind of clearinghouse for federal funding for community programs and things like that. So searching through that, I think, is a useful tool. Also look at things like the United Way, things like that, and some state and local governments also are will be giving out grants as well. So whether you're talking about Macon-Bibb or Houston County or Warner Robins or Cochrane or whatever, there may be some opportunities there. I think a lot of it's just getting plugged in with the people that do these things, as well as the Middle Georgia Regional Commission. So hopefully that can get you some opportunities on your radar there. Let's see. I think we tackled most of the questions in the, matter of fact, all of the questions seem to have been covered in the chat. So we'll move on to our next question, which I think is it's Dr. Caverly's turn, and that is about the state legislature passing a law that was signed by Governor Kemp already on religious liberty, or a state RFRA as it's known. What was that bill all about? Why was it enacted? What is the background behind RFRAs in general and this particular religious liberty bill?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. My understanding, which is limited on this matter, but my understanding is that these types of bills are a clarion call among the political right in this country, which for the most part has believed, and whether we want to say justly or unjustly or whatever, that's stuff people in the audience have to make their own determinations on that. But that the United States took a secular turn, and as a product of that secular turn, that it went so far, this is the argument, it went so far that it led to an internal religious oppression, oppression particularly leveled against Christians, and especially particular types of Christians, particularly evangelicals and fundamentalists, and of that sort of thing. And so these types of laws are meant to protect those groups from the excessive influence of secular humanistic teachings and advocations, and so on and so forth. So a thing like this. So there's a version of this that happened down in Florida, and which is my state of residence now, in which they kind of tackled the teaching of evolution, and they have rules placed on how you could teach evolution now, and so that's where these things are. So I found a thing that's written up. I'll just read it. Religious liberty. State and local governments wouldn't be able to substantially burden a person's religious freedom. It's Senate Bill 36. But opponents say it would enable discrimination. And Governor Kemp signed a measure on Friday. So it's the real question, I think, of this thing, and I'll turn this over to Professor Hall, is because he's a con law guy. The real question, I think, here is that by protecting one's group's religious liberty, are we opening up an avenue to discrimination towards another group? Particularly if you're protecting a majority group, are you leading to an avenue for discrimination against the minority group? So, and that sort of thing. And so I think that that's really where the debate is going to be about. I would imagine, I'm just guessing here at this point, I would imagine the ACLU is going to look for a way to do a lawsuit over this and take it up in the courts. I could be wrong about that, but that's my basic understanding of it, as limited as it is. But I'm going to turn this over to Professor Hall, because I know he's a constitutional specialist, and he is more adept at these sort of things than I am.
Thank you, Dr. Caverly. Fantastic response there. I have to be careful. If I start talking about this, I will not stop. So I want to make sure that I pace myself. When it comes to this religious liberty law in Georgia, this is going to take us all the way back to 1990. And there is a case before the federal Supreme Court called Employment Division versus Smith. For everyone in our American government classes, we have already covered this. Employment Division versus Smith represented a fundamental dichotomy of religious freedom. The First Amendment gives us two very specific elements of religious freedom. The first is the Establishment Clause. And for anyone who's ever heard the phrase separation of church and state, that's a reference to the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause protects us from Congress passing laws respecting the establishment of religion. So Congress can't pass a law, and through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, neither can the states, which identifies this as our official religion. Congress can't help religion. Congress can't hurt religion. Congress needs to stay away from religion. That's the Establishment Clause. On the other hand, we have the Free Exercise Clause, which is relatively self-explanatory. You can freely exercise your religion within limits. Now, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, they may seem like brothers and sisters, but they are not. They are mortal enemies. Whenever the court upholds the Establishment Clause, it almost necessarily violates the Free Exercise Clause and vice versa. That's what happened in Employment Division versus Smith. We're in Oregon, it's 1990, and we have a Native American Indian who was consuming peyote as a part of his religious rituals. He was fired from his job. He applied for unemployment from the state of Oregon, and he was denied. Now, when the state of Oregon denied him unemployment because they considered him to have been fired for cause, he was breaking the law. This became a huge question for the court. Do we uphold a Native American Indian's right to consume peyote and protect the free exercise clause, or do we uphold the government's ability to pass laws of general applicability that accidentally infringe on the free exercise clause? The late Justice Scalia wrote this opinion, and it was a doozy. It has had ramifications to this day. The court in Employment Division versus Smith said, you know what? If there is a law of general applicability that accidentally infringes on your free exercise of religion, we are going to allow it. The alternative would allow people and their religion to become laws and governments unto themselves. This, as far as we have discussed so far, might seem like not that big a deal, but it became a huge deal because, as Dr. Caverly mentioned, evangelical Christians in particular in the early 90s, they responded ferociously to this. They feared the slippery slope that if state and federal governments could limit the free exercise rights of Native American Indian religions, they could eventually take away the free exercise clause rights of evangelical Christians. So after the court said, listen, if it's a law of general applicability, we're going to allow it, even if it infringes upon religious liberty, Congress responded, and they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which basically said, from this point forward, we are going to apply strict scrutiny to federal and state governments whenever they pass any laws that infringe upon the free exercise of religion. And when strict scrutiny is applied, as we've covered in class, whatever the discriminatory law is, it's probably going to be overturned. In other words, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act at the federal level said, from this point forward, we want to kind of go away from the Employment Division versus Smith opinion of the court and make it so that government cannot force you to violate some religious text in order to uphold the law. What does this mean? Well, the court immediately struck down Congress's power to tell states what to do. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act at the federal level now only applies to the federal government. But many state governments started passing Religious Freedom Restoration Act laws of their own, so that people who are exercising strongly held religious beliefs could not be forced to violate those beliefs, even if it involved discrimination. And that's at the heart of this case. This religious liberty law is saying that you cannot be forced by the state of Georgia to violate your own religious beliefs if it means doing so will keep you within the parameters of the law. Meaning, I'm an evangelical Christian. For whatever reason or reasons, I am fixated on the book of Leviticus, and I am overwhelmingly upset at the thought of same-sex marriage or even same-sex people. I will be able to put a sign in my window on my sandwich shop that says no same-sex couples may enter my building. That is an extreme version of this, but that is the concern of opponents of religious liberty laws like this that are predicated on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If I have a strongly held religious belief, can I, in exercising that belief, violate civil rights law? This bill says yes. That has a lot of implications. This, interestingly enough, was passed by the legislature all the way back in 2016, but then Governor Nathan Deal vetoed it. Republican Governor Nathan Deal vetoed it because it was allowing for the prohibition of, it allowed for pastors, for example, to discriminate against same-sex couples if they wanted to get married. And the governor vetoed it at the time because they researched the entire history of the state of Georgia. And as it turns out, there had literally never been an occasion where a same-sex couple was trying to force a pastor to marry them. But as it has now been passed almost a decade later, the principal concern is this. On the one hand, opponents say it is bringing back that protection of religious freedom. And from that perspective, it is absolutely a positive thing. But the negative side is that if in exercising my firmly held religious beliefs, I am allowed to discriminate against people in violation, in some cases, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, well, that's clearly a problem. So the controversy here will not go away soon. And what this legislation is doing is erring on the side of religious freedom while possibly opening the door to dramatic and extraordinary forms of discrimination. I'm going to stop right there and turn it back over.
Okay, thanks. Before we move on, we did have a couple of questions in the chat. I know if Dr. Hall and Dr. Caverly had a chance to look at them. So the second one kind of immediately released this question, so probably tackle that one first from Stacy. So how would this decision by Scalia potentially affect the religious freedom of Jews, Muslims, Satanists, and others who have religious rights to abortions? So I'll let you guys tackle that one first, and then we can get to Alan's question.
Great question there. Now, regarding Scalia's opinion in the 1990 Smith case, that was where he was saying, listen, if there's a law of general applicability that accidentally infringes upon free exercise of religion, we're okay with that. We will not let individuals, because of their religion, become governments unto themselves. It's the response to that, the legislative response in the form of federal and state Religious Freedom Restoration Act laws that's trying to overdo that. It's trying to say, no, late Justice Scalia, we are not going to allow religious freedom to be hindered as long as it is a strongly held religious belief. So the current law would open the door possibly to strongly held religious beliefs that would call for certain procedures, certain ceremonies, certain actions, certain discriminations, the lack of action. So that would open the door. Scalia's opinion wouldn't really have affected that as much. The current religious liberty law that Georgia passed, and about half of the states have passed similar laws, would open the door for exactly that, for exemptions to the law be based on firmly held religious convictions. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thanks. I think we tackled that one. So Alan has a question specifically for Dr. Hall, though Dr. Caverly, I assume, could also answer this as well. Now the Department of Education is no longer in place. I am assuming responsibility for education shifts back to the states. Who exactly will be in charge with that? And then goes into some more detail about how specifically this would affect Macon Bibb in particular. I don't want to read the full question, but Dr. Hall?
Oh, yeah, great question. First and foremost, the Department of Education, I'm assuming we're talking about at the federal level and the Trump administration's attempts at destroying it. The Department of Education is still there. All departments, all agencies, independent executive agencies, regulatory agencies, every single thing in the executive branch must be created by law, which means Congress creates it. Congress appropriates funds for it. Congress passes the law that it must then enforce. It takes Congress to dissolve a department. So while the Department of Education is definitely under attack by the Trump administration, and many have been fired, it is still there. But in terms of the effect on the states, we have to remind ourselves who's in charge of public education in Georgia. This is a question I ask a lot in class, and hopefully some of my students are screaming right now, Georgia. The states are in charge of public education, K through 12 and post-secondary. The lion's share of funding for universities and colleges in the state of Georgia is the state of Georgia. That would raise the question, what does the Federal Department of Education do in that case? And where the Federal Department of Education is incredibly important is in funding. They do fund things like Pell Grants. They also are overwhelmingly involved in research. They study the 50 different states, trying to identify best practices that can then be encouraged elsewhere. But overwhelmingly, what the Federal Department of Education does is it protects students from discrimination. The Federal Department of Education, one of its core elements is to make sure, even though we have 50 different governments in charge of public education, the Federal Department of Education helps to enforce federal laws that require equality, that will provide equal levels to some extent of education to make sure laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act are enforced. The federal Department of Education, philosophically and practically, makes sure that the 50 different states educating their public school students in K through 12 have a level of equality, that they don't discriminate, that students aren't left out, that students aren't left behind. And losing that, back to your question on the states, the federal government is basically, and very rapidly, in a way that one could argue hasn't necessarily been well thought out, are devolving a lot of those powers back to states. This is a continuation of the devolution process begun by the Reagan administration in the 80s, where more power was sent from the federal government to the states. So to answer your question, the long version, what impact will this have on states? It's going to nominally give state governments exponentially more control over public education, which they already have an exponential amount of control over. It's going to remove several federal government oversights to maintain equality and to prevent discrimination at the public school level. If you're optimistic, and if you're a fan of the state government doing everything and the federal government doing nothing except declaring and waging war, you might be a fan of this. If, on the other hand, you think some states will do a very poor job of not allowing discrimination and of guaranteeing equality, then this is going to be something of a by God nightmare. And a lot of the responsibilities the federal government has in terms of preventing discrimination in public education, a lot of that power comes from the history of states taking part and allowing discrimination. So a lot of the responsibility the federal government has in the Department of Education, it has because in the past, states had proven, some states, that they were incapable or unwilling to aggressively prohibit discrimination and lack of equality. So I'll stop right there and hand it back over.
Well, the only thing that I'd really like to add, just briefly here on what Professor Hall said, is that what could happen over time is you could see a situation like what we're seeing with the abortion policies, where you have vastly different educational policies by a state and region. So if you go to school in Massachusetts, it will be a very different experience than if you go to school in Georgia. Whereas if we want to look for, well, what has been, some of the successes, or you could claim somewhat successes of the existence of the Department of Education, has been that it has worked a lot of the ways, and not just in the way of protection against discrimination, but also in being involved in the dissemination of funds through grants and aid, of having a somewhat equitable, and if you look close at it, you'll find it's not equitable, but a somewhat equitable distribution of education funding across the country, so that if you're a poor country kid, you can get a reasonably the same level of education as a upper class, kid that coming out of the Upper East Side of New York City or something. And that there is some fear among at least liberal education advocates that we're at risk of losing that relative balance, and that's potentially that could happen. Now we don't know. Now after saying all that, I'm going to throw some cold water on it. Here's why I'm going to say throw some cold water on it, and I know we got to move on, but keep in mind how this was done. This was done to by recommendations based off the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk's little organization within the White House office. This has been done through executive action. So the Congress can pass that with a law. They can overtake it with a law. Potentially, court decisions could hold it back or cause amendments or so on, or even shut it down. And then there's a third thing. You realize that the next Democratic president, whoever that man or woman is, can just undo this with a stroke of the pen. I mean, that's the thing about executive action. So if you want to think about the separation of powers, and we also talk about the division of powers, that's what's going on here. I do have one comment to make also about Stacy's religious question, which I found very fascinating, by the way. Stacy, thank you for asking it. There is an asymmetry in how the politics of religion have been practiced in the United States. And that asymmetry is that the world religions, the recognized world religions, and of course in America, the big one on that is Christianity, and to a lesser extent Judaism, and increasingly Islam, but we're getting large numbers through immigrants of Hindus and Buddhists and so forth. The world religions have been treated under the law differently and have been practiced with greater recognition of rights. Because when I thought Stacy's question is very interesting, she put Satanists up there, Satanists. The smaller religions, the pagans, the Wiccans, they have historically, this was, by the way, part of the problem the peyote case came out of, is that the smaller your religion, the less punching power you have in the political system as an interest group. And our politics have reflected that asymmetry in those things. So I just saw that there. I thought that was an interesting thing. But anyway, I know that Mr. Chris here wants to move on, so let's move
on. Just a couple of brief things, and yeah, we are running a little short on time here. We've got about 30 more minutes, but just a couple of things to add to that. First, getting to the minority religions thing, I think we see that, for example, in the case that kind of followed up from the peyote case, the City of Bern versus Flores case, which dealt with Santeria and more traditional religious practices and things like that, right? And so, or not traditional, I guess more folk religious practices, if you will, right? Where less organized religion or religion associated with minority cultures and things like that might get less respect from the government than quote unquote world religions, if you will, right? I think that case, for example, dealt with the ritual sacrifice of chickens, if I'm not mistaken, and I can't imagine a American court case finding the same way in a case that dealt with, say, the proper slaughter practices for beef in Islam or Judaism, right? So that's just a point worth reiterating there. As far as the question from Alan about the responsibilities of public education, right, in Georgia in particular, right, ultimately that comes down to, yes, the state government, but also the school districts, right. So in most of the state, right, we have county level equivalent school districts, right. For example, in Macon-Bibb County, right, there is one school district, the Bibb County School District. There are a few municipal school districts, the Dublin School District, the Atlanta School District, but the vast majority of the state has kind of unified county level school districts, and so they would be ultimately responsible for education. I think the broader point I would make about standardization and things like that is that a lot of standardization in American education is not, and historically has not been imposed by the federal government. It's really been imposed by the universities, by essentially dictating what sort of students they will accept. They are essentially saying to K through 12 school districts across the country, this is what your curriculum has to look like, right? In Georgia, the public universities have the recommended high school curriculum. If you don't meet that curriculum, you're not going to get into a university system of Georgia institution, or if you do get in, you're going to have to take some extra classes to graduate because they've decided that you need a certain number of units in these various areas, right? And regardless of what's going on in the world, there are enough parents out there that want their kids to be able to go to prestigious universities that they're going to push for school districts to make sure they're still implementing a reasonably high quality education, and that that long predates the existence of a federal Department of Education and that sort of thing. And again, I think as we talked about in our previous discussions on this, at the end of the day, whether it's the Department of Education, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, or whatever, there's a separation between program funding and program administration, right? Just because a program is administered out of the Department of Education now doesn't mean it always has to be administered that way. Just as immigration policy has not always been the Department of Homeland Security. Trade policy and customs enforcement has not always been in the Department of Homeland Security, right? So let's move on to our next question from our proposed questions, which is dealing with issues of transgender individuals. I know the legislature has passed a couple of bills that might affect people that are, young people as well as older people that identify as transgender. So what are those bills? I can't remember who went first last time, so I think we're odd number, which I think is Dr. Hall, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'll run away with this. Great question. The state legislature has passed two significant bills related to transgender rights. The first, SB 1, the Senate bill, has prohibited at the K through 12 and post-secondary level, so kindergarten through 12th grade and all universities. There is now a prohibition to participate in single-sex team sports if you are not playing with the biological sex that you were assigned at birth. In other words, you cannot be a transgender woman playing in all female sports anymore, K through 12 and universities. No more transgender. It could be transgender men playing with women, but it's usually the controversy generally involves transgender women playing with women. So transgender athletes are no longer allowed to play in sports in the state of Georgia, which corresponds to the gender that they identify with. That has been a controversy raging through the country for several years now. But it's important to keep in mind that we're dealing with the data on this is incredibly difficult to find. So I'm going to roughly say less than 1% of the population. Anyone feel free to correct me there. But this is a small minority that will be affected in a way that supporters of the legislation feel like there is a physical, there's a discrepancy in the physical strength of biological men, especially those after puberty, than biological women. So the advocates of this prohibition of transgender athletes playing with the gender that they identify with is that they consider to be overwhelmingly unfair for biological men who are transgender women to play with women in sports. Opponents of the bill think that it could open up transgender students to traumatizing events. They think that this could be legislation that is something of a license to harass or bully or harm transgender athletes. At the end of the day, when it comes to representative government outside of court protections, over 70% of Georgians support this bill. So this was a piece of legislation that had overwhelming support among Georgia voters. And on the other hand, as far as today, there haven't been any identifiable examples of where this actually happened. So as of right now, unless there was something that I've missed, this legislation is preventing something that has not yet happened. But again, the odds are that it will happen at some point in the future. So there is that. And secondly, there was another piece of legislation that was passed that prohibits the Georgia Department of Corrections from allowing prison inmates to receive sex reassignment surgeries, hormone replacement therapies, and cosmetic procedures designed to alter the inmate's genitalia, so that within the Department of Corrections in the state of Georgia, we will no longer it's now prohibited to spend taxpayer dollars on gender reassignment surgery or anything related to that. Proponents of this call it just common sense legislation supported by the majority of taxpayers. Opponents say sex transition care is uncommon in Georgia prisons. So it's legislation that doesn't really have a lot of examples of what it is preventing. And there's also a question by opponents that this could be an Eighth Amendment violation. The Eighth Amendment, the last part of the Eighth Amendment, as our students now know, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment. So there's that. So the state has now banned transgender athletes from playing in sports unless they're playing with the gender they were assigned at birth. And the Georgia prison system will no longer take part in the payment of transgender surgeries or anything related to that. Those are the two major transgender bills that were passed.
Well, the only thing that I'll add is that this is a part of a national movement that's run across the states. It's very popular in conservative politics. There's also back in the presidential election, Vice President Harris took a lot of heat because she had previously come out that she favored gender affirming care for prisoners. So this is a part of a larger. The other thing that I will say about this, so this is a part of the conservative reaction to, remember, it's the stuff I said about the secular humanist state. This is part and parcel of that. It's also part and parcel of a larger movement of the development of the rise of social affairs, of social politics. Traditionally, especially in political science, they used to always say this, that at the end of the day, it was about economics. They had all this stuff about the retrospective voter and all that. People voted based on sociotropic, that means applied to the society as a whole, economic evaluation. And then some said, well, no, they actually do some pocketbook stuff. Pocketbook is your own individual household. Is it micro or macro? Anyway, the point was that was all driven by domestic economics, political economy. But debates over transgenderism have, as a part of rise of this, the rise of social politics. Ronald Engelhart wrote a whole book on this years ago. He called it the rise of post-materialist values. What do you get in politics what does politics look like once you have relative economic security? And we could see that this would be perhaps Engelhart was onto something. This is a manifestation of that. That just puts it in a larger classification. There's one thing I will say on this, then we'll move on from this, but there have always been people who are transgender. There's always been men that looked in reflective surfaces of one kind or another and say, well, I see a pretty girl there. That's always been there. What has changed is that this has become these have become political issues, and these have become national issues. Previously, this stuff was all kind of at the state and local level, and it was mostly handled in the private social sphere, principally driven by conventional values, traditional values, and so on and so forth. That's a manifest. These are manifestations of those things. Just for context, I saw on there Clara asked a question about the Success Academy, and Dr. Lawrence responded to it. I believe the Success Academy is a charter school, and so if that is the case, then the concept of it being a charter school is not unique to Georgia, but it might be a unique phenomenon. But the specific Success Academy might be unique to Georgia, but I believe it's a charter school. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because Clara, you're one of my students. So I am going to get confirmation on that or find out that I'm wrong. And in class on Thursday, I'm going to give you your answer. So how's that sound? And then you can tell the world. And I see a thing here on betting, on sports betting, but I think we're going to move to that. So if there's some interest in it, I'm okay with us moving that up. Let's go ahead and talk some betting.
Okay. Yeah. So I did decide we'll go ahead and move that up. This year, the legislature again failed to pass any bills allowing for sports betting in Georgia, which may or may not require a constitutional amendment. There's been a bit of discussion about that over the years. Why has the state been unable to legalize sports betting despite its growing popularity and prominence in recent years? And of course, it's become legal in a bunch of other states. And as Bagish, I believe is how you pronounce that, points out, there would be, some tax revenue from that. Why do you think the state has been unable to get that passed? And I guess we'll let Dr. Cafferly answer that one first.
All right. Well, I guess I invited this on myself when I said let's move it up. Huh? Okay. So the issue of sports betting. Well, for starters, this is something that did not pass sign and die. So it didn't make it, but it will. I think we can make a prediction. It will inevitably be put forth again in the next legislative session. And if it doesn't make it, then it's going to get put in the next one. And here's why. There are massive interest, political interests out there, interest groups that are heavily vested in promoting at least sports gambling. And I would tell you this, one of the things, you remember that whole bit about traditionalism, the social conservatism of the South? Well, over time, if you go to any Zippy Mart here in Georgia of any size, you're going to look over and you're going to see those betting machines. And you get all kinds of people buying, spending half their paycheck on buying one card or another on gambling. So gambling is already here in Georgia. So the question will be, is it going to spread? And, will the backlash of social conservatism, the social traditionalism, be effective in fighting that off, given the strong economic interest? Because keep in mind, one of the great fissures in the Republican Party, and the people out here, my students know this, one of the great fissures in the Republican Party between the Main Street Republicans, those are the economic conservatives, versus the church pew Republicans, those are the social conservatives. A lot of the social conservatives, they don't like the gambling. But those economic conservatives, they like the money. And so we'll see how that plays out and that fights out. My guess is that the interest groups that are supporting sports betting in Georgia are going to keep pushing this until they win. And it might be a year from now, and it might be 2 years from now, and it might be 5 years from now, and it might be 10 years from now. But I think that Georgia is going to fall just like my state of residence, Florida, fell. Florida didn't fall, but it almost fell. And then, although they got a modified version of it now, and you go down, when I go home, I flip on the news and I get commercial after commercial about the sports betting that's going on down in Florida now. And so you can download the apps and do all kinds of crazy stuff. But I would think it's at the end of the day, this is an interesting phenomenon. Remember I said the rise of social issues. Well, the political science literature for years has said that at the end of the day, the economics trumps social stuff. But there's some recent stuff that suggests that may not be as true. So I don't know, but I'm going to go out somewhat on a limb here. I'm going to say this. I think in this case, I think the economics is going to win. And I think over years to come, we'll see how right I am. I'm wrong all the time, so we'll see how right I am. I think the sports betting is going to come through. I think it's going to happen. But we're going to see what Professor Hall has to say about this.
I completely agree with everything Dr. Cavalier just said. I really can't add much. Why has it not passed? Again, social conservatives in Georgia fear that it will lead to increased gambling addiction, which can lead to increased poverty, which can lead to, for social conservative evangelical Christians in Georgia, it is just more sin. Now, I think this is the 7th legislative session in a row that this has been introduced, and it has not succeeded. I agree with Dr. Cavalier. It will continue to be inserted into legislation year after year after year, and eventually it will pass.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think the only thing I would add to that is, some of this may come down to changes in the party coalitions and things like that. As the Republicans in Georgia become increasingly dependent on working class votes, or more dependent on them. They may feel more pressure from their new constituents, if you will, to push for gambling, because I think if either party, one group of voters they're probably looking for is young men, and young men like to gamble on sports. That may be, in addition to the economics, something that ends up trumping the, no pun intended, the more social conservative elements of the Republican coalition. So we'll see how that plays out. I think Dr. Cavalier is right. In the long term, probably it'll win out. To some extent, there are already some loopholes, I think, just based on some of the advertising I've seen where, hey, we can do this in Georgia now. So clearly some people were either riding pretty close to the edge on what constitutes sports gambling or that sort of thing. I don't want to pick on specific companies, but I have seen ads that say, hey, this is legal in California and Georgia. It's like, okay, I didn't think it was legal in Georgia, but you knock yourselves out if you want to, try that. And potentially go to jail, but go for that. Anyway, Alan correctly points out that some of our neighboring states, including Alabama, have already legalized it. Tennessee, it's already legal in Tennessee. I was seeing, I go up and visit family in Tennessee. I'm always seeing ads for sports gambling. Of course, here in Georgia, I'm always seeing ads for sports gambling as well, even though it's may or may not be legal here. In any event, I don't think that genie is going to get put back in the bottle. Another kind of controversial issue that didn't get very far in the legislature this year, or actually got pretty far in the legislature this year in this particular case, but kind of died on the last day, was an issue of speed cameras in school zones. Why have these cameras become controversial? Why do you think that it wasn't able to kind of make it over the finish line? In terms of, I know there were a couple of different proposals out there to limit the use of the speed cameras or perhaps phase them out entirely. Neither of those proposals passed. Why has this become controversial, and what are the prospects for the future of the speed cameras?
Great question there. I myself have contributed about $300 to the speed cameras in the Lake Joy area in Warner Robins. First and foremost, there were two bills introduced, both in the House. One was basically wanting to ban all speed cameras in school zones. Now, what do these school zone speed cameras do? I really hesitate to explain. It's literally in the name. There are digital cameras that take a picture of your license plate if you're speeding, and they mail you a ticket in the mail, which you have to pay. These speed cameras are specifically being allocated for public education, for school zones. It's unique in that, on the one hand, the parent in me likes the thought that this is forcing people to slow down when going past my children's school zones. But then the taxpayer / just American in me, who hates all forms of taxation and fines, and also not a big fan of robots distributing these fines. I generally prefer a human being in the form of a state trooper or a municipal police officer. So there's several controversial elements here, but there's also elements that Georgians and all Americans kind of support: slow down in school zones. The two legislative attempts at altering the current status quo, one wanted to ban them entirely. And then it was amended so that they would phase it out by 2028. Another, while not wanting to ban them entirely, wanted to limit the times that they could be used, increase the signage to make sure absolutely everyone understands exactly what they're going into, so that you know beyond any shadow of a doubt that you are about to be under the scrutiny of a camera. And some also wanted to define by law exactly where the revenue for these speed cameras would go. I could have probably said this at the very beginning and done this a lot faster. Neither one passed, so nothing has changed. However, this will, I think, absolutely be introduced again next year. The authors of both legislation have said they are going to introduce this again. I think that we're going to wind up either banning it entirely or amending it to the point where we will decrease the amount of time that they are in use to only when school is getting in or getting out, and specifically defining by law where the funds can go. So far, there's been over like $200 million earned with about 50 million of that going to out-of-state corporations who might be involved with the installation of the cameras, the technology that goes into the cameras. The thought that some of this revenue is going out of the state of Georgia is what is really a sticking point with a lot of people who would support the cameras but don't support them as they are. So I think I would argue, probably if I was betting in Georgia, when we can bet, that this will probably be upheld with extraordinarily aggressive limitations and regulations on its application. But that's where we are right now.
I agree. I think that's that's the inevitable outcome of this thing. People don't people don't like them. They don't like these cameras. In general, writ large, there's a backlash against not just these kind of automated speed zone cameras in the school zone, but really everywhere and around the country. These things. So a lot of this really came out of cost efficiency stuff in law enforcement. So they said, well, we if we put up automated cameras, then we don't have to have a cop there, right? Or we don't have to have a security officer there. If we and then at the same time, this also came out of kids getting run over and stuff like that happened in accidents, people burning through these. They put the sign says, this is the speed zone for the school, and then people ignore it and they run right through. But I agree. I don't think that I think that there'll be a continuance of something, but it's going to be far more regulated. And I agree with the notion it'll probably be reduced down to just the school hours, which you could argue is what the intent of the policy is supposed to be. The intent of the policy is not to catch Chris Lawrence driving through there at the zone at midnight. It's to catch Matt Caverly driving through the zone at 7 o'clock in the morning, and where the kids are at risk. And so I think that there's probably going to be, like in most things, some kind of rending out and compromise. That's probably what will happen.
Okay. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, I think a lot of the hostility has come down to the confusion about what hours they're in place, what days they're allowed to use them, that sort of thing. I know there have been some controversies there. Signage in particular, I know is an issue. I know my experience, I've yet to receive any tickets, but I know in Warner Robins, in the area I drive through, right, there aren't even, basically the signs just say, okay, well, here are the times the speeds, they'll reduce speed limits in effect, but there's no flashing icon, at least in Bibb County, right, there's flashing lights and that sort of thing. So it's hard to know. You have to kind of peer at the signs that is exactly, check your watch and see if it's like this is not helpful, right? It's almost like they're trying to entrap you into breaking the school speed limit. And so what inevitably happens is, when I'm driving down 41 or one of these other roads that has a speed camera on it, I'm stuck behind somebody doing 35 miles an hour because that's the speed limit for when the school's in session. And of course, that's not the speed limit that's actually in effect at noon or at 6 p.m. or something, right? But they're so afraid of getting a ticket now, they're actually slowing down to like becoming a danger in themselves. So I'm not sure that's all that helpful. And then the other thing, right? I think is again. I think they were sold to people as sort of, okay, this is going to keep kids safe when they're coming from school or getting out of school and that sort of thing. I think that's a perfectly legitimate issue. But I think when we look at kind of the revenues and things like that, it seems like a lot of the revenue is coming from those hours where, school is not letting out, where school, the kids are safely behind the fence and that sort of thing. And I think that's where a lot of people's problems with the cameras have come up, where it was kind of sold as, okay, this is going to keep kids safe, but if there aren't kids there to hit, then how is it going to keep them safe? So we do have a related question. Could there be a similar attempt to ban the flock cameras? So for those that are not familiar, those are those cameras that are kind of sitting by the side of the road that have a solar panel attached to them. You'll probably see them a lot. They look like kind of an overgrown webcam. They're on a lot of streets. My neighborhood decided to install them. I'm not entirely sure why, because it costs us a fortune. But my answer to that would be probably not. But I'd be curious what Dr. Hall and Dr. Cavalier have to say. And this is probably going to be our last question, unless we want to squeeze one last thing in.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, John. Okay. The only thing that I could see a reaction to try to get rid of them is if there's a group of people, if there's an interest group that comes out and puts together and makes an argument that these kind of cameras are some kind of violation of privacy, that these kind of cameras are interfering in, this is big government interfering in how I want to live my life. And if they can successfully sell that, then you could possibly see that. But to throw a little cold water on that, though, is that you could argue that there are interests out there that will probably organize around more prescient things than just a specific kind of camera surveillance. But in general, it does get into this, because I know some of the people here are in the public safety program. I recognize some of the folks here, that this is a matter of public safety, actually. What is the dividing line between public safety and the right of privacy? Where is that line? That is a perennial debate within public safety. And so here we have it going on here. We might seem kind of trite, we're talking about cameras, but the truth of the matter is this actually exists in every security measure that is out there. And there are tons of them. And they're there for good reasons, but you can argue that sometimes they're there for maybe not so good reasons. So it's a matter of profound debate.
I agree. Couldn't really add much. I mean, again, from the constitutional perspective, the court has long since determined you do not have any expectation of privacy in public. But if any of these cameras are possibly seeing into someone's backyard, maybe that could be an issue. But yeah, I don't see the possible prohibition of the public school, slow down in school zone cameras. I don't see that translating to a prohibition of the others. Again, you have no expectation of privacy in public. But as a policy area, that doesn't mean that we can't get rid of them.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I think we are very close to out of time. So I do want to first thank our panelists, and I'm sharing an image, hopefully everybody can see it, about an event that's taking place tomorrow on the Cochran campus with Dr. Cavalier. So Dr. Cavalier will be speaking on global versus domestic, decoding presidential and congressional power. I think a very timely topic. Maybe more timely than Dr. Cavalier anticipated when he was proposing this talk. So he's talking about his book, Issue Areas in Political Time, tomorrow, Wednesday, April 9th, in the Roberts Memorial Library on the 3rd floor on the Cochran campus at 2 o'clock, 2 to 3 p.m. So if you have time and are on the Cochran campus or are able to get away to the Cochran campus, I'm hopefully going to be able to try and make it. Please do so, because I think you'll find a very interesting talk from Dr. Cavalier. So that's one event I wanted to share with everyone before we depart. We also have another event coming up in a couple weeks. Dr. Hall and Dr. Thomas Matchok, also in the public safety program, and who's been part of our discussion series earlier this semester. They're going to be talking on Tuesday, April 22nd, on the Russian-Ukrainian war prospects for peace. That's our tentative title. That's going to be at 3:30 in the afternoon, in person on the Macon campus in the Arts Complex Theater in the School of Arts and Letters building. So hopefully some of you will be able to join us for that as well. We don't have a flyer and poster yet for that. I expect we'll have that posted soon. So I'll get you everybody some information on that shortly once we've got that title finalized and our panelists finalized as well. There may be another panelist as well that I can't announce yet, but we'll see. Hopefully we'll have that lineup finalized by the end of the week or so, and be able to get that poster out. So I'd like to thank both of you for a very interesting and compelling discussion. I wish we'd be able to get to a couple other things, but we got through most of what we wanted. And of course, more importantly, perhaps we got through most of the questions that those of you in the audience were asking. So we appreciate your feedback. We appreciate you guys coming, all of you coming. And like I said, thank you again to Dr. Caverly and Dr. Hall for their participation, and thank you in the audience. And we'll go ahead and adjourn for today because Dr. Hall has to go off and coach some youth football. So
thank y'all. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matt.
Have a
Thanks,
good evening.
everyone.